You ever see a man walk into a place like he owns nothing and still take control of everything? The guard didn't even look up at first, just the scrape of boots on gravel cutting through the late afternoon heat. Then he saw him. An old man, late 80s maybe, moving slow but steady, like time had tried to wear him down and failed. "Sir, you need to turn around," the guard said, voice sharp, practiced, the kind that came from memorizing rules instead of earning them. The old man didn't stop, didn't argue, just kept walking, eyes forward, like the gate, the rifles, the rank on their collars didn't exist. A second guard stepped in, blocking him now, hand hovering near his radio. "Restricted access. You're not cleared to be here." The wind shifted across the tarmac, carrying the distant hum of engines and the faint rattle of flag lines snapping against their poles. The old man finally stopped, just a few feet from them, close enough that they could see the details. Worn denim jacket, faded almost gray, boots scuffed but clean, hands steady at his sides. No badge, no visible rank, nothing that mattered in their world. "I'm already where I need to be," he said, voice low, rough like gravel under tires, but calm, too calm. The younger guard smirked, glancing at his partner like he'd just heard a joke. "Yeah? Well, not without authorization, you're not." A lieutenant approached then, crisp uniform, posture tight, the kind of confidence that came fresh out of training. "What's the situation?" he asked without looking at the old man. "Sir, civilian attempting to access restricted area. Non-compliant." The lieutenant finally turned his gaze, slow, deliberate, scanning the old man from head to toe, taking in every wrinkle, every sign of age, every reason to dismiss him. "Sir, this is your final warning. You need to leave. Now." The old man didn't move, didn't blink. The silence stretched just long enough to make it uncomfortable. Then the lieutenant stepped closer, invading his space, and that's when he saw it. A small, bent piece of metal pinned crooked on the old man's jacket. Tarnished, almost worthless looking. He reached out without thinking, tapping it lightly with his finger. What is this supposed to be? The moment his finger made contact, something shifted, not in the air, not in the base, but in the old man's eyes. A flicker, quick, controlled, like a door opening somewhere deep and slamming shut just as fast. He gently moved the lieutenant's hand away. "Don't touch that," he said, quieter now, but heavier, like the weight of the words had changed. The guards exchanged a glance, irritation turning into something sharper. Behind them, unnoticed, a young specialist had gone still, watching the way the old man stood, the way he didn't react, the way the silence around him felt wrong. He reached slowly for his radio, thumb hovering over the button, heart picking up just enough to notice. Somewhere across the base, a door was about to open. The specialist's thumb finally pressed the radio, but he kept his voice low, almost careful, like he did not want to disturb something he did not fully understand. "Control, this is Specialist Cole at Gate 3. I think you might want to verify a name." The guard beside him scoffed, shaking his head. "Do not waste command's time with this." Cole did not look at him. His eyes stayed locked on the old man. "Name is Daniel Hayes." The line went quiet. Not static, not interference, just silence, the kind that did not belong on an active base. The lieutenant exhaled sharply, already losing patience. "That is enough. Escort him out." One of the guards stepped forward, reaching for the old man's arm, but stopped halfway. Something about the way Daniel Hayes stood there made the motion feel wrong, like grabbing hold of something that was not meant to be touched. Hayes did not move. His gaze drifted past them, toward the runway where heat waves shimmered above the concrete. For a second, it looked like he was not seeing the present at all. "Control, do you copy?" Cole tried again, voice tighter now. The reply came back, but it was not the relaxed tone of routine operations. It was clipped. "Alert. Say that name again." Cole swallowed. "Daniel Hayes." Another pause, longer this time. Then a different voice cut in, older, sharper, carrying weight without needing volume. "Who confirmed that?" Cole straightened instinctively. "Visual confirmation, sir." The lieutenant frowned, stepping closer to the radio. "This is Lieutenant Harris. There is no reason to escalate this. It is a civilian. Stand by, Lieutenant." The interruption was immediate. Clean. Final. Harris froze, jaw tightening as he realized the voice outranked him by a margin that could not be argued. Around them, the air seemed to shift. The guards were no longer smirking. They were listening, waiting. Somewhere across the base, a chair scraped hard against a concrete floor. Papers moved. Boots hit the ground with purpose. Back at the gate, Harris tried to regain control. "Sir, you are creating a disruption. If you do not comply, we will be forced to." Hayes turned his head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes. There was no anger there. No challenge. Just something older. Something that did not need permission to exist. Harris stopped mid-sentence. The words did not come back. Cole's radio crackled again, louder now, no attempt to hide it. "Do not let him leave. Repeat, do not let him leave." The guards exchanged a quick look, confusion replacing confidence. "He was not leaving," Cole muttered under his breath. A distant door slammed open. Even from the gate, they could hear it echo. Then came the sound that did not belong to routine operations. Fast footsteps. Measured. Direct. Not running, but close enough to it that everyone felt it. Every head turned toward the main building. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground, stretching toward the old man as if the base itself was reaching for him. Hayes remained still, waiting, like he had done this before, like he already knew how this part would end. The first figure appeared at the far end of the tarmac, cutting through the shimmering heat like a blade through glass. A single officer moving faster than protocol allowed. His uniform immaculate, but his pace urgent, controlled only by discipline, not hesitation, and behind him, 2 more followed, then 3, the formation building not by command but by instinct, as if something unseen had already issued the order. And every soldier within range had heard it. Specialist. Cole felt it before he understood it. The shift in gravity, the way conversation died without being told to stop, the way even the wind seemed to pull back and wait. And then he saw the insignia catch the sunlight. Colonel, full bird, unmistakable, advancing with a focus that ignored rank, ignored procedure, ignored everything except the old man standing at gate 3. Lieutenant Harris straightened instantly, boots locking into position, voice ready to reassert control. "Sir, we have a civilian." Breach. But the words fell apart as the colonel passed him without a glance, not even a flicker of acknowledgement, as if Harris had become part of the background, just another object on the base that did not matter in this moment. The guards felt it too, that quiet erasure, their earlier confidence draining into something uncertain, something colder. As the colonel closed the final distance and stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Daniel Hayes. For a second, nothing happened. No salute. No command. Just 2 men standing across from each other, one in crisp authority, the other in worn silence. And then the colonel's breath caught, subtle but unmistakable, his eyes locking onto the small, bent piece of metal pinned to Hayes's jacket. And in that instant, something inside him shifted, something old, something buried under years of rank and responsibility. Hayes did not move, did not offer explanation, his posture unchanged, as if he had already lived this moment long before it arrived. The colonel's hand rose slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, but deliberate, every inch of the motion carrying weight. And when his fingers reached the edge of his cap, the entire line of soldiers behind him froze, because they understood what was about to happen before it happened. Lieutenant Harris blinked, confusion flashing across his face, trying to reconcile the reality in front of him with everything he believed about order and authority. But there was no space left for doubt, no time to question. The colonel completed the motion, a perfect salute, sharp, unwavering, held not as a gesture of routine, but as something deeper, something earned long before any of them had put on a uniform. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, pressing down on every person at the gate, and one by one, almost without thinking, the guards mirrored the action, then the soldiers behind them, a chain reaction of respect rippling outward until the entire entrance stood locked in the same position, eyes forward, breath held. Cole felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever had just happened, whatever history stood in front of them in the form of that quiet old man, it was far beyond clearance levels, beyond rank charts, beyond anything written in their manuals. And through it all, Daniel Hayes remained still, receiving the salute without pride, without surprise, as if it was never about being recognized, only about something that had been promised a long time ago finally being remembered. The colonel held the salute longer than regulation required, longer than anyone at the gate had ever seen. And that was when the unease settled in, not loud, not dramatic, but deep, like a realization that arrived too late to ignore. Lieutenant Harris lowered his hand a fraction too early, then corrected himself. The movement small, but enough to betray the crack in his certainty, because this was not how the system worked, not how authority was supposed to flow, and yet no one dared speak. No one dared question the moment unfolding in front of them. The colonel finally lowered his hand, slow and deliberate, and for the first time, he spoke, his voice quieter than expected, stripped of command, carrying something closer to respect. "Sir, I did not know you were coming." And the shift was immediate. The words "sir" landing heavier than any order ever given on that ground. Daniel Hayes tilted his head slightly, as if measuring the distance between who the colonel was now and who he had once been, his eyes steady, unchanged. "You were not supposed to," he replied, calm, almost distant, like the outcome had never depended on notification or permission. The guards exchanged glances again, but this time there was no trace of arrogance. Left, only confusion mixed with something else, something closer to caution, as if they had stepped into a situation they were not cleared to understand. The wind moved across the base again, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and sun-warmed concrete. And somewhere in the distance a flag snapped sharply against its pole, the sound cutting through the silence like a reminder that time had not stopped, even if it felt like it had. The colonel's gaze dropped briefly to the bent piece of metal on Hayes's jacket, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away from his posture, replaced by something younger, something less certain. "I have not seen that in a long time," he said, almost to himself, and the words carried memory without explanation. Hayes's fingers brushed the edge of the pin, not adjusting it, not presenting it, just acknowledging its presence. "Most people would not recognize it," he said, his voice steady, without pride, without invitation, and that was when Specialist Cole felt it again. That quiet confirmation that whatever this object was, it did not belong to the present. It belonged to something older, something that had shaped the people standing here long before they wore the uniforms they wore now. Lieutenant Harris tried once more to find his footing, stepping forward carefully, his tone more controlled this time, but no longer sharp. "Sir, with respect, we still need identification on file for anyone entering this area." And even as he said it, he knew it sounded smaller than it had a few minutes ago, reduced by the weight of what had already happened. The colonel did not turn his head, did not acknowledge the request directly, but his voice carried back just enough. "Stand down, Lieutenant." Simple, clear, leaving no room for interpretation, and Harris obeyed immediately, the words cutting through his remaining resistance like a final line drawn. Hayes looked past them again, toward the runway, toward something none of them could see, and after a moment, he took a single step forward, not asking, not waiting, and this time, no one moved to stop him, because whatever authority they thought they had at this gate had already been replaced by something they could not measure, something that did not need to announce itself. And as he walked past the colonel, the silence followed him, heavy, deliberate, as if the base itself was remembering something it had almost forgotten. Daniel Hayes did not look back as he crossed the line of the gate, his steps unhurried, measured, each one landing with the same quiet certainty as the last, and behind him the formation remained frozen for a fraction too long, as if no one had been given permission to breathe again. It was the colonel who broke it, lowering his hand fully and turning just enough to follow, not ahead, not beside, but half a step behind, a position that did not go unnoticed by anyone still watching. Specialist Cole felt the shift immediately, the unspoken understanding that the chain of command had not been broken, but something older had just taken precedence over it. The base stretched out ahead in long lines of concrete and steel, sunlight reflecting off metal surfaces, the low hum of distant engines returning slowly as normal operations tried to reassert themselves. But even that sound felt muted, like it did not want to interrupt what was happening. "Clear the path," the colonel said quietly, not raising his voice. Yet the instruction moved faster than any shouted order, personnel stepping aside instinctively, conversations cutting off mid-sentence, every movement aligning to create space for the old man to pass. Lieutenant Harris remained at the gate for a second longer, his posture rigid, mind racing to reconstruct what had just happened into something logical, something procedural. But there was no section in his training that explained why a colonel would follow a man with no visible rank, no credentials, no announcement. He turned sharply, falling into step several yards behind, not close enough to intrude, but too close to ignore, his earlier authority now replaced by a need to understand. Ahead, Hayes slowed slightly as they approached a row of hangars, large steel doors half open, shadows stretching across the ground like dark water. And for a moment he paused, not because he was unsure, but because something about the place demanded it. His eyes moved across the structure, tracing lines only he could see, and the faintest shift passed through his expression, not emotion exactly, but recognition. The colonel noticed it immediately, stopping when Hayes stopped, his own gaze following the same direction. And for the first time since he arrived, there was hesitation in him, not uncertainty, but something heavier, something that came from memory rather than command. "It is still here," Hayes said, almost to himself, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. And the colonel nodded once, slow, deliberate. "We kept it that way," he replied. The words simple, but the meaning behind them stretching far beyond the moment. Specialist Cole, now trailing at a distance with the others, exchanged a glance with another soldier, neither of them speaking, both aware that whatever this location was, it mattered more than any clearance level they held. The air near the hangar felt different, cooler, shaded, the smell of oil and metal lingering beneath the surface. And as Hayes took another step forward, crossing into that shadow, the base seemed to quiet again, not by command, but by presence. Somewhere behind them, a radio crackled, a voice asking for status, for confirmation, for explanation, but no one answered right away, because there was nothing simple to report, nothing that fit into a standard line of communication. Hayes continued inside, disappearing partially into the dim light, and the colonel followed without hesitation, leaving the others at the threshold, standing just outside the edge of something they had not been invited into, something that felt less like a place and more like a memory waiting to be opened. The interior of the hangar swallowed the sunlight behind them, replacing it with a dim, steady glow from overhead fixtures that hummed softly, their light reflecting off metal surfaces worn smooth by years of use. And as Daniel Hayes stepped fully inside, his pace slowed even further, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, like a man walking into a place that had never really left him. The colonel followed 2 steps behind, his posture still precise, but his eyes no longer scanning for threats or protocol, instead fixed on the path Hayes was taking, as if he already knew where it would lead. The space was larger than it appeared from the outside, stretching deep into shadow, with equipment lined along the walls in careful order, not new, not obsolete, but preserved, maintained with a kind of quiet respect that did not come from regulation alone. Hayes stopped near the center, his gaze settling on something just beyond the reach of direct light, and for a moment, he did not move at all. The air felt cooler here, carrying the faint scent of machine oil and old metal layered over time, untouched by the constant rotation of personnel outside. "You kept more than I expected," Hayes said finally, his voice low, almost absorbed by the space itself, and the colonel stepped forward just enough to stand beside him. "Not ahead, never ahead. We were told to preserve it exactly as it was," he replied, each word measured, careful, like they carried more than simple instruction. Hayes gave a slight nod, his eyes tracing the outline of a machine partially covered in shadow, its shape unmistakable even in the dim light, and his hand lifted just a few inches, not to touch, but to acknowledge, as if contact was not necessary to confirm what it was. For a brief second, the present seemed to thin, the hum of the lights fading into something else, something older, the echo of a different sound layered beneath it, distant but persistent, and though no one else could hear it, the weight of it settled into the space. Outside the hangar, Specialist Cole remained just beyond the threshold, along with several others, none of them daring to step inside, not because they had been told to stay out, but because the boundary felt clear without words, like crossing it would require permission they did not have. Cole leaned slightly, trying to see past the edge of the door, catching only fragments, the silhouette of the old man, the still figure of the colonel, and something large between them that seemed to anchor the entire scene. Back inside, Hayes lowered his hand again, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle release, as if confirming that what he came to find had not been lost. It never really left, he said, almost quietly enough to miss. And the colonel's response came without delay. Some things are not meant to be replaced. And for the first time, there was no rank in his voice, no command, only agreement. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, carrying the weight of years compressed into a single moment, and neither man rushed to break it, because whatever needed to be said here was not meant to be spoken quickly. Outside, a distant radio call repeated again, asking for status, for clarification, but still no one answered, because the answer was not something that could be explained over a channel, not something that fit into a report. Hayes took a slow breath, the kind that settled deeper than the lungs, and then he took one step closer to the shadowed machine, not reaching out, not claiming it, just standing near it, like a man returning to something that had always been part of him, whether the world remembered it or not. For a long moment, neither man spoke, and the silence inside the hangar settled into something almost tangible, like a presence that had been waiting years for this exact return. And Daniel Hayes finally moved his hand forward, slow and deliberate, stopping just inches from the surface of the machine, his fingers hovering as if memory alone was enough to bridge the distance. The colonel watched closely, not with curiosity, but with the quiet focus of someone who understood the weight of what was happening, even if he had never been able to fully explain it to anyone else. "You remember where everything was," the colonel said, his voice low, respectful, and Hayes gave the faintest nod, his eyes tracing lines invisible to anyone else. "You do not forget something like this," he replied, and there was no pride in the statement, only certainty. Outside, Specialist Cole shifted his stance, unable to take his eyes off the scene, feeling as though he was witnessing something that did not belong to his generation, something that had been carried forward without being spoken about, and the others near him felt it too, the quiet gravity pulling their attention inward, away from routine, away from everything they thought defined their roles. Inside, Hayes finally let his fingertips make contact, not pressing, not testing, just resting there for a brief second, and the gesture was enough to change the entire atmosphere, as if the space itself acknowledged it, the hum of the overhead lights blending with a deeper, older resonance that could not be measured. The colonel drew in a slow breath, his posture straightening instinctively, not out of protocol, but out of respect for something that predated his authority. "They told us to maintain it, but they never told us why," he admitted quietly, and Hayes withdrew his hand, turning his head just enough to meet his eyes. "Some things are not explained," he said. "They are remembered." The words settled between them, simple, but carrying more weight than any formal briefing. And for a moment, the colonel looked less like a commanding officer and more like a man trying to understand a piece of history he had inherited but never fully owned. Beyond the threshold, a senior sergeant approached, drawn by the unusual stillness, stopping just short of the entrance when he saw the posture of those already there, the unspoken rule holding him back without a single word exchanged. Hayes took a step along the side of the machine, his pace slow, measured, as if retracing a path only he could see, and the colonel followed again at that careful distance, not intruding, not leading, just present. "We almost moved at once," the colonel said after a moment, his voice carrying a hint of something unresolved. "Command wanted the space for newer systems," and Hayes paused, not turning, not reacting outwardly, but the stillness that followed was enough to answer before he spoke. "But you did not," he said, and the colonel shook his head slightly. "No, sir, we did not." And this time the word "sir" carried something deeper than rank, something closer to acknowledgement. Hayes resumed walking, his gaze steady, and for the first time since entering the hangar, there was the faintest shift in his expression. Not a smile, not relief, but something quieter, something that came from knowing that what had been left behind had not been erased. Outside, the radio finally fell silent, as if even the bass itself had decided that this moment did not need to be interrupted, and inside the hangar, the two figures continued forward, moving deeper into the shadow, towards something that had been waiting long before any of them had arrived. The deeper they moved into the hangar, the quieter everything became, not just in sound but in presence, as if the world outside had been left behind completely. And Daniel Hayes slowed again near the far end where the shadows were thicker, where the light no longer reached cleanly. And there, partially concealed beneath a faded canvas cover, stood something that did not belong to the present day. The colonel stopped just behind him, his posture tightening slightly, not from tension, but from recognition, the kind that settled in the chest before it reached the mind. Hayes stood still for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the outline beneath the cover, and then, with the same measured calm he had carried from the gate, he reached forward and pulled the edge of the canvas back just enough to reveal the surface beneath. Worn metal, aged but intact, bearing marks that were not damage but history, each one placed there by time and use rather than neglect. The air seemed to shift again, the hum of the overhead lights fading into the background as something else filled the space, not a sound exactly, but a presence, a memory that did not need to be spoken aloud. "We thought it was better to leave it untouched," the colonel said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that suggested the decision had not been simple, and Hayes nodded once, slow and certain. "You made the right call," he replied, and that was all that needed to be said. Outside the hangar, the small group had grown. More personnel drawn by the unusual stillness, by the absence of normal command flow, yet none of them crossed the threshold, each one stopping at the same invisible line, as if the space inside required a different kind of clearance, one that could not be granted through rank or authorization. Specialist Cole felt it strongest, the pull of wanting to understand, balanced by the certainty that understanding was not meant for him. Not yet. Inside, Hayes stepped closer to the uncovered machine, his hand resting briefly against the surface this time, not hovering, not hesitant, and the contact seemed to complete something, not for the object, but for him, as if a circle that had remained open for years had finally closed. The colonel watched in silence, his eyes steady, absorbing every detail, not for report, not for record, but for himself, because whatever this was, it would not be written down in a way that captured its meaning. "Do they still train on this platform?" Hayes asked after a moment, his voice returning to the present just enough to bridge the gap between then and now. And the colonel shook his head slightly. "No, sir, not anymore. Everything has moved on." And Hayes let that answer settle without reaction, neither approving nor dismissing it. He withdrew his hand slowly, his gaze lingering for a second longer, then shifting forward, deeper into the hangar where something else waited, unseen but clearly known to him. The colonel followed again, without question, without hesitation, and behind them, the quiet remained, heavy and complete, holding the attention of every person at the entrance, because whatever was happening inside that space was no longer just about a man or a machine. It was about something larger, something that connected past and present in a way none of them had been trained to understand. And as Hayes continued forward into the dim light, it became clear that the reason he had come here was not yet finished, not yet revealed, and whatever came next would explain everything they had just witnessed without a single word needing to force it into place. Daniel Hayes came to a final stop at the far end of the hangar where the light barely reached, where the air felt stiller, heavier, as if it had been holding something in place for a very long time. And for a moment he simply stood there, not looking back, not explaining, just letting the silence settle fully around him. The colonel remained a step behind, waiting, no longer as an officer expecting instruction, but as a witness to something that did not require permission. Then Hayes reached into the inside pocket, a folded piece of paper, aged, edges softened by time, handled carefully not out of fragility but out of respect, and he held it for a second before placing it gently on a small metal surface beside him, not presenting it, not announcing it, just setting it there like something that had finally found its place again. The colonel's eyes dropped to it instinctively, and though he did not move closer, the recognition came almost immediately, not from reading it, but from what it represented, the kind of document that was never meant to be public, never meant to be explained in briefings or written into reports. Hayes looked down at it only briefly, then lifted his gaze forward again, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture lighter now, as if the purpose of his visit had reached its end without needing acknowledgement. "It was never about the machine," he said quietly, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the colonel, and for the first time, the meaning of everything began to align, not in words, but in understanding. The colonel nodded once, slow, deliberate, the weight of realization settling in fully. It never was, he replied, and there was no hesitation left in him now, no uncertainty, only respect. Outside the hangar, the waiting soldiers felt the shift even without seeing it, the tension easing slightly, not because they understood what had happened, but because something had been resolved, something unseen but undeniable. Specialist Cole exhaled slowly, not realizing he had been holding his breath, his eyes still fixed on the shadowed interior, knowing that whatever had just taken place would never be fully explained to him, and yet would stay with him longer than anything written in training manuals. Inside, Hayes took one final look around, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging, and then he turned, his movement calm, unhurried, the same quiet presence he had carried from the moment he stepped through the gate. The colonel stepped aside this time, not out of protocol, but out of respect, creating space without needing to be told, and as Hayes walked past him, there was no salute this time, no formal gesture, because it was no longer needed. The silence followed him again as he moved toward the exit, the faint light from outside growing stronger with each step, and behind him, the colonel remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze resting on the paper left behind, understanding now that some legacies were not meant to be carried forward loudly, but preserved quietly, exactly as they were. Hayes reached the edge of the hangar and stepped back into the sunlight,